Well, the most pressing at the moment is the accessibility angle. There is a huge legislation sort of change coming in April. So it's becoming a very legal requirement that you consider the accessibility of your products, and you try and do that to a really good level. So I think definitely, how you can make your product inclusive and accessible and an enjoyable place for people to learn is a big thing. So that's one of them. The other thing is sort of respecting the learning process and trying to understand more about how people learn. I think particularly with the rise of AI, there's a real concern around AI doing the learning for you, which is impossible. Like AI can't learn for you. There has to be a degree of friction and a degree of energy invested by the learner to really learn. Whether that's sort of how you memorize things, how you take notes, how you how you revisit things, however you like. Do you physically write things on flashcards? Do you use digital tooling? Do you use other platforms? Like, I think you've got to think about where friction's actually a really positive thing. You need to introduce friction to ensure that, in the right areas, to make sure that it's productive. There's some things that you can automate and remove, so there's like people can definitely sort of learn in a better way. But I do think friction is important. I think trying to automate everything and resolve like that friction is not going to benefit learning on like the bigger picture of learning. And I think figuring out how we essentially like preserve some of that so people can process the content they're trying to absorb, or they can learn something, is really important. And annoyingly, I can't think of a third, but I think that's two that I could go for.
It's an interesting balance to strike, isn't it? 'Cause I think as a human race over time, everything that we ever innovate is to make life easier for ourselves and more comfortable, whether that be windows on a house or a car instead of a horse. Like these things have increasingly over time been how is we going to make life easier? Learning's almost the one that we still have to actively make a little bit difficult
Mm.
and not impossible, but it still has to be a process. It can't be like a checkout at a supermarket. And I think where AI's come in and been able to go for a lot of tasks, we'll do it for you. Don't worry about that. Here it is. That in a way can be counterproductive if not used in the right way. When you're looking at AI then into the future, obviously I know you touched on things like quizzes and things. What do you potentially see the future of that looking like when it comes to learning platforms in the future? How might that look?
Yeah, I think the problem is at the moment the conversation is very focused around generative AI and it generating content and media. And I know one of the big concerns in institutions is around how this sort of plagiarism, and how it's really hard to detect some of this stuff. But I think if you and that's a whole other podcast episode that we could
Yeah.
easily go into, right? So skirting around that, I think the challenge that you've got is how you really harness AI in products that isn't through that traditional chat interface or Gen AI interface. I think AI is going to be incredible at personalization, and we've talked a lot in this sort of episode about how you create that environment, that sort of unique, like almost special environment for someone to learn in a way that really is tailored to them. And I think AI is going to be incredible at that, in terms of it understanding who you are and what resonates with you and how you learn almost, what's the format and styles of which you're really like consuming content really works for you. And I think this is an area that is still quite unexplored. I think people are still focusing quite heavily on the sort of Gen AI chat interfaces, where actually there's so much more powerful implementations for AI. So yeah, I think we're starting to sort of figure that out. I think we're figuring out, beyond just generating summaries and text, like where it can show up in products in a way that is nice and not just forced in. I think the problem is everyone feels like they have to force AI into their product, but actually it's like, what problems are you trying to solve? How can you use this technology to to reduce or remove friction where it's not needed, like where it's getting in the way of someone learning, versus where can you sort of get out of the way and allow that person to go through a bit of a struggle, to go through a bit of friction, to ensure that knowledge really embeds in them. And I think the personalization stuff is just super interesting. We need to think about privacy aware ways in which we do this, and we need to be super careful about consent and ensuring that everything around it. Often you're dealing with people who might be vulnerable or might be particularly at risk, and you want to make sure that you sort of respect the responsibility of what you're building for there. But yeah, imagine if you had a system that really understood your dyslexia in more detail, or how you work in a way that supports you can work with your ADHD. I think there's huge potential for this technology that is currently untapped.